Thick fried dough with flies. In the early morning haze of a medieval village, the streets begin to stir. There is no rush, no traffic. Only the soft shuffle of leather shoes on dirt, and the smell of smoke from hearth fires being lit. Near the edge of the market square, an old woman sets up her stall. It's just a plank of wood laid across two empty barrels. On it rests a stack of thick, greasy dough. They are fried, if you could call it that, in old, reused lard. The oil crackles, with every new batch, dark and heavy with days of history soaked into it. The dough is dense. There is no fluff, no sugar, no spice. Just flour, water, and salt. Maybe, if you're lucky, you might taste a hint of onion, but mostly it tastes like burnt crust and smoke. And then there are the flies. They swarm the stall like nobles at a feast, buzzing, landing, leaving behind their footprints in grease. No one swats them away. No one seems to mind, because this is breakfast. For the peasants of the village, this dough is a treat. It's cheap, filling, and warm. Three qualities that mattered more than anything else. A few copper pennies is all it takes to fill your stomach. And in a world where food was never guaranteed, that was enough. The woman wraps the dough in a piece of old cloth. Maybe it's been used before, maybe not, but no one asks. A man takes the fried lump in both hands, steam rising in the morning cold, and he bites in, slowly. The outside crunches. The inside? Still raw, but it's food. It fills the mouth. It slows the hunger. And around him others do, the same. Farm boys heading to the fields. A mother with two children sharing one piece between them. An old man leaning on a stick, chewing as if he's in a trance. No one speaks. There's nothing to say. It's too early, and too normal. This is just how mornings go. In the distance, a bell rings. The church. Time to begin. And as the village stirs fully awake, the dough stalls start to empty. The flies follow the last scraps. The oil cools in the pot. And somewhere, in the rising sun, you realize people long ago were not so different from us. They just had thicker skin and thicker dough. The market begins to hum, not loudly, just a soft, sleepy buzz, like the wings of bees on a warm morning. Traders open their sacks. Bakers roll up their sleeves. A pot begins to boil over a small fire in the corner of the square. It belongs to a hunched old man. His hands tremble as he stirs the contents. Porridge, but not the thick, creamy porridge you might know today. No butter, no milk, no cinnamon swirl on top, just oats, a little water, and a pinch of salt if he has it. The porridge bubbles slowly, thin, gray, and watery, like someone stirred gravel into cloudy soup. Still, people come. A young boy with mud on his feet hands the old man a single copper coin. The man nods. He reaches for a broken wooden ladle, dips it into the pot, and pours the slop into a chipped clay bowl. Steam rises, but barely. The porridge isn't hot, just warm enough to soften the oats and melt the ache of an empty belly. The boy sits on the ground, no spoon. He drinks it slowly, like broth. This porridge was a staple for the poor. It wasn't tasty, it wasn't filling, but it was food, and it was cheap, and that made it precious. People added whatever scraps they had, wild herbs, beet, leaves, even onion skins, anything to trick the tongue into believing it was more than boiled grain. But most of the time, it was just porridge. It slid down the throat with little effort. No chewing needed. It warmed the stomach, even if it didn't satisfy it, and sometimes that was enough. On colder days, they'd call it poor man's stew. On bad days, they called it water with hopes. Either way, it was the same. A bowl of soggy oats and silent prayers. In the background, a rooster crows. Somewhere, a pig grunts, and the porridge pot keeps bubbling. It doesn't promise joy, or energy, or even taste. It simply says, "You'll get through the morning," and that, in medieval times, was a luxury all its own. In the back corner of the village fair, shaded by a crooked roof and half a curtain, sits a wooden table. On that table, a tray of tarts. They look inviting, in a way. Crusts browned, filling glistening under the mid-morning sun. A sweet smell lingers. Soft, sour, almost fruity. But these are no royal pastries. They're made from apples that have sat too long in the cellar. Wrinkled, soft, sometimes spotted with a hint of mold. The baker doesn't mind. He chops them fine, adds a spoon of honey if he has it, and folds them into dough made of coarse flour and goat lard. Then bakes them in a stone oven, one by one. No timer, just instinct. The result? A tart that tastes strange. The first bite is sweet, but quickly turns sour. The crust crumbles too fast. The filling bubbles oddly on the tongue, like it's still fermenting. Some say it's delicious. Others say it reminds them of vinegar mixed with soap. But no one throws it away. Because in a place where food is never certain, a tart is a gift, even if it gives you a stomachache. Even if the sweetness is just a mask for rot. You chew slowly, cautiously, hoping today's batch wasn't too far gone. You watch the other villagers, chewing, swallowing, blinking, waiting. It's a gamble. Every bite holds the question, will this tart warm my belly or twist it? But for some, that's part of the thrill, like a game, one where the prize is either comfort or cramps. And still tomorrow, the same tray will be there. New crusts, same apples, soft, slightly sour, and strangely satisfying. Because in the Middle Ages, even a rotten tart was better than no tart at all. The road is long. Dust clings to your legs. The sun presses down like a weight. Around you other pilgrims walk in silence, their sandals worn, their eyes heavy. There's no feast waiting at the next village. No feast ever comes. So you stop, sit beneath a tree, and reach into your sack. Inside, a small bundle wrapped in cloth, damp from sweat, rough from time. You open it, there it is. Your lunch, a chunk of old bread, and a handful of pickled cabbage. The bread is hard, too hard for teeth unless you soak it in something. It's spotted with blue, maybe green, but mold is normal out here. You scrape it off, or you don't. After all, it adds flavor. The cabbage, sour, sharp, fermented in a wooden barrel weeks ago, salted, pressed, forgotten. Now it's your closest thing to a snack. You tear a piece of bread, stuff in some cabbage, chew. It crunches, then squishes. The flavors don't dance, they wrestle. Your mouth puckers. Your eyes sting slightly, but strangely, it wakes you up. This was pilgrim food, not sacred, not blessed, just cheap. Cabbage was easy to grow and easy to store. Bread was everywhere, even if it wasn't fresh. Together they made a kind of peasant sandwich, a mix of preservation and desperation. Other pilgrims eat the same beside you, some with cheese that smells like wet cloth, others with dried onions or salted roots. No one complains, not really, because out here, flavor isn't the point. Survival is, you finish slowly. Wipe your hands on your robe, look ahead. More road, more hunger, maybe more cabbage, and with a full enough belly, you begin to walk again. Not satisfied, but strong enough. The sun is higher now. The market is loud with haggling, clinking, and distant laughter. But in one small corner, tucked behind a butcher's stall, something sizzles. It's not meat, not really, just pieces of pork fat, cut thick, dropped into a shallow pan of lard, then fried until they puff, brown and crackle. They pop in, the pan like fireworks underwater. The smell? Heavy, salty, deep, and a little shameful. This wasn't food meant for lords or guests. Fried pork fat was scrap, waste, some would say. Bits the butcher couldn't sell. Too soft, too greasy, too odd. But for the hungry, it was gold. People lined up, coins in hand. Not for meat, but for fat, because fat meant fuel. It meant warmth in the belly, strength, in the arms, and, to some, comfort. It melted in the mouth. It clung to your fingers. Sometimes it came wrapped in an old leaf. Sometimes it came on a stick. No matter how it came, it was eaten fast. You could hear the crunch across the stall. One bite, and grease ran down your chin. No herbs, no sauce, just salt. But in that moment, in that bite, something primal stirred. It wasn't healthy. It wasn't elegant, but it was real. And for a few brief seconds, the world slowed. The cold vanished. The ache faded. And all that remained was the taste of heat and hunger, meeting in your mouth. People would say later, "It's just fat," but those who ate it knew better. They knew that in the dirt and smoke of a medieval village, fried fat was more than food. It was joy, in the greasiest form possible. The sun dips low over the village rooftops. Shadows stretch long across the cobbled streets, and the last stalls of the day begin to pack away. But not all of them. Near the well, half hidden under an awning of patched cloth, one stall still draws a small crowd. On the table, resting in a wooden tray, are what look like pastries. Small, golden brown, round, they glisten slightly, as if brushed with honey. But the smell is odd, not sweet, not fruity. It smells like onions. The woman behind the stall works quietly, spooning filling into fresh dough. Her hands move fast. She's done this 1,000 times. She drops a finished tart into the Firestone oven beside her, and the smell grows stronger. Roasted onion, a hint of vinegar, and something sugary? A boy walks up with a few copper pennies, places them in a carved dish, and receives one tart wrapped in cloth. He bites in. His expression doesn't change. He chews slowly, then walks away. This is not surprising. This is not strange. This is dessert. You see, in the Middle Ages, the line between sweet and savory wasn't just blurry. It barely existed. Sugar was rare. Honey even rarer. Spices were expensive and not everyone had access to dried fruit. But onions? Onions were everywhere. And so desperate for flavor, for something special, people experimented. They boiled onions in vinegar and honey. They wrapped them in pastry. They called it dessert. The result, a mouthful of hot, soft onion, glazed in sweetness, with a crust that might be soft or burned, depending on the heat of the fire. It didn't exactly taste good, but it was different. It was interesting. And more than anything, it was special. Noble kitchens made more elaborate versions. They'd mix sweetened leeks with crushed almonds, sometimes dates, sometimes wine. It was exotic and confusing too. The tongue. But to the medieval mind, food didn't need to fit neat boxes. Dessert could be sharp. It could be sour. It could be confusing. It just needed to be rare. Back at the stall, another customer picks up a tart and peels the edge of the crust. Steam curls out, carrying that same strange perfume, sweet and pungent. They take a bite, chew carefully, and after a moment, they nod. It isn't joy. It isn't delight. It's just different. And in a world where most meals were gray, bland, and boiled, different was enough, so they bought it again, and again. And someday, they might even call it a treat. Not because it made them smile, but because it made them pause, and sometimes that's all people wanted. A reason to stop, to chew, and to think, that was strange. The market was loud today. Children ran between stalls with sticks in their hands. A pig squealed somewhere near the butcher's tent, and beneath it all, a quiet rhythm of trade continued. Coins clinked, sacks opened. Bread was sold, but not all of it was real. At the far edge of the square, near a cracked stone wall, sat a man with two baskets. One was filled with thick, crusty loaves, golden brown, dusty with flour, round and beautiful. The other, hidden under, cloth, lighter, strange-smelling, cheaper. Guess which sold faster? You see, in the Middle Ages, bread was life. It was what you ate for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. So, of course, it was also what people cheated with. The man's real loaves were fine, made with wheat flour, maybe some yeast if he had it. Dense, heavy, and expensive. But the others? The ones he sold most, made with chalk, and ground beans, and sawdust. He wasn't the only one. Across medieval towns and cities, bread fraud was everywhere. Bakers mixed bark into flour. They added powdered bone to stretch the dough. Some even used clay. And the people who bought it? They knew. They could taste it. But many had no choice. One woman holds a loaf in her hands. She knocks on it. The sound is hollow, like wood. She shrugs. She buys it anyway. At home, she'll soften it with broth, soak it until it falls apart, then serve it to her children as stew. It will fill them. It might hurt their stomachs, but it's better than nothing. Officials tried to stop it. There were rules, laws. Inspectors were sent to test bread by weight. Punishments were harsh, fines, lashes, even public shame. Some bakers were forced to wear loaves hung around their necks as they stood in the town square. But the practice never truly stopped, because hunger never stopped. And when food becomes desperation, morals become optional. A boy walks past the bread seller, holding a copper coin in a closed fist. He points at the cheaper basket. The man nods, pulls a small lump of bread from beneath the cloth, and hands it over. The boy doesn't smile. He doesn't speak. He just bites in and winces. It's dry, bitter, gritty, but it's food. And so the scam continues. Not out of greed alone, but survival. The seller feeds his family. The buyer feeds his. Both know the lie. Both accept it. In a strange way. It's honest, and when the sun sets and the baskets are empty, the man leans back against the stone wall. He doesn't look proud. He doesn't look ashamed, just tired, just full. Because in a world where the line between bread and dirt blurred, you did what you had to do. Evening settles over the village like a worn blanket. Smoke curls from chimneys. Chickens huddle close. The air smells of ash, cold earth, and faintly of soup. Not a feast. Not even dinner, really. Just broth. Boiled since mid-afternoon in a black iron pot. Thin, brown, quietly steaming. It sits on 3 stones outside a small wooden hut, tended by an old woman who stirs it with a stick more than a spoon. Inside the pot, water mostly. Bones, perhaps. A carrot, if she had one. Maybe onion skins. And a pinch of salt, if she didn't forget. It is a soup of suggestion. There is no meat. Only memory. The bones have long been sucked dry. The fat skimmed off. But when the pot boils, it smells like something more. And that's what matters. A group of children sits nearby, waiting. They don't chatter. They don't laugh. They just watch the steam rise. Their hands are red from cold. Their feet bare, but their eyes don't leave the pot. The old woman ladles broth into small wooden cups. No bowls, no spoons. They drink it like tea. Slowly, quietly. It's hot. It's salty. It tastes like hope. This broth, as simple as it is, was common in homes with no meat, no bread, no butter. People boiled everything they could find: roots, weeds, scraps, anything that left a trace of flavor. Even leather shoes were boiled once, when times were truly bad. But this broth wasn't just about flavor. It was about presence, the warmth of holding a cup, the steam rising to your nose, the illusion of a meal. Sometimes someone would slice a crust of old bread and float it in the cup. It would soak and swell, pretending to be stew. Other times, children would pretend to chew invisible meat. "Mine has chicken," one boy might whisper, and no one would correct him, because imagination fills more than the stomach. A traveler once passed through, and when offered the broth, he sipped it politely, then asked, "Where is the rest?" The villagers just smiled. That was the rest. In a world where food was uncertain, broth became a ritual. It brought people together, warmed their hands, slowed their breath. It didn't feed the body much, but it fed something else. The pot bubbles, low. The old woman sets down the ladle and stares into the fire. The children, holding empty cups, lean into each other and sigh. They aren't full, but they aren't cold. And tonight, that is enough. Because sometimes the smell of meat was more powerful than meat itself, and a belly full of broth felt like a kind of miracle. The tavern was louder than usual. Chairs scraped, ale spilled. Someone laughed too hard in the corner. The fire snapped in the hearth, and above it all, a sharp smell lingered in the air. It wasn't the drink. It wasn't the smoke. It was cheese. Sitting at the center of the wooden table, cracked, leaning slightly to one side, was a wheel of soft, yellow-brown cheese. Its edges were dark. The middle sagged slightly. A faint fuzz had started to form on one side, and yet it was the most valuable thing on the table. The cheese had come from the neighboring village, a rare delivery. It had been carried in a cloth sack tied to a donkey for 3 days. By the time it arrived, it had aged more than anyone expected. But that didn't stop the tavern from slicing it up and serving it with crusts of hard bread. Man picked up a piece. He sniffed it. He winced. Then he took a bite anyway. Across from him, another man watched. "That's my piece," he said flatly. "Wasn't marked," the first replied, chewing slowly. "I saw the innkeep cut it for me. Then, you should have eaten faster." The table went quiet. Someone slurped their stew a little louder, pretending not to hear. A dog barked once, then hid under a bench. The two men stared at each other. Between them, the cheese sagged further. Fights in taverns weren't rare, but over cheese, that was special. You see, in medieval times, cheese was complicated. It could be a luxury. It could be peasant food. It could be a gift or a punishment. Hard cheeses traveled well, lasting for months. But soft cheeses? They aged. They fermented. They turned. And yet people still ate them, sometimes out of taste, sometimes out of pride, often out of sheer hunger. This particular cheese was on the edge, too old to be safe, too soft to resist, but too rare to throw away. The man who claimed it as his leaned forward. His hand hovered over the table. The other man, still chewing, smiled slightly. Then, slowly, deliberately, he reached for another piece. A cup tipped. A bench fell. The tavern exploded into movement. Not a full brawl, just enough shouting and shoving to send the dog yelping out the door, and the innkeeper rushing in with a broom. The cheese fell to the floor. One piece rolled beneath the hearth. Another was stepped on. And just like that, it was over. The palace kitchen was never quiet. Knives scraped against stone. Pots hissed. Feet shuffled over straw-covered floors. And through it all, smoke curled upward, carrying scents of meat, spice, and something else. something fishy, literally, in a massive bronze cauldron near the back wall. Cooks stirred slowly. Inside, floating like half-sunken boats, were fish heads, dozens of them, eyes cloudy, gills curled, bones exposed. This wasn't a mistake. This was dinner. The royal stew, made for visiting lords, bishops, or even the king himself, was meant to impress. It used what was once considered the finest part of the fish, the head, not the flesh, not the fillet, but the face. Why? Because in medieval Europe, the head held the fat, the jelly, the soft parts, and softness meant luxury. The poor gnawed on bones, the wealthy slurped cheeks and brains. The broth itself was murky, thickened, with breadcrumbs flavored with vinegar, onions and herbs. Sometimes saffron, sometimes almond milk, whatever made it look golden, rich, and expensive. And when poured into pewter bowls with a ladle carved like a dragon, it looked like a royal meal. But how did it taste? That depends. If the fish was fresh, caught that morning, scaled and cleaned with care, it could be tender, smooth, even delicate. But more often, the heads had traveled days, stored in barrels of brine, carried by mule, reheated over smoky fires. By the time they reached the palace, they were falling apart. Eyes burst in the pot, jaws unhinged, tiny teeth floated to the surface like unlucky stars. The nobles didn't complain. At least not out loud. They sipped, they nodded, they praised the depth of flavor, but many left the bowl half full. A servant once whispered that the king himself pushed away his stew after biting down on something crunchy. They say he spat it into a cloth and muttered, "Tell the cook I said nothing," which, in royal language, meant, "Never serve this again." But the stew kept coming, because appearances mattered more than taste. If it looked rich, it was rich. If it came from the palace, it must be good, and no one wanted to admit they didn't enjoy the most precious part of the fish. So servants scraped leftover stew into buckets. Some fed it to the hounds. Some snuck it home, added barley, and made it edible again. One boy, an apprentice cook, even claimed he could tell fortunes by reading the swirl of oil around a floating eye. No one laughed, because in the medieval court, weird was normal. Rotten could be royal. And a fish head, served in gold, was still just a fish head. The feast was meant to impress. The long table was draped in deep red cloth. Candles flickered from iron chandeliers. Goblets of spiced wine clinked as lords laughed softly into their beards. At the far end of the hall, a door creaked open, and in came the centerpiece, the royal goose pie. It rested on a silver tray, carried by two sweating servants. The crust was thick, golden, shaped like a crown. Steam curled from the edges. The smell? Savory, herby, faintly gamey. And just as the servants lowered it to the table, a single feather drifted from the crust. Not decoration, not accident, just forgotten. The head cook, trembling in the shadows, watched as the noble guests leaned. In one lord poked it with a knife. A second feather floated loose, then another. He sliced the crust. Inside, goose meat, packed tight with herbs, onions, and raisins. And here and there, unmistakably, clumps of feather still clinging to the flesh. Not browned, not burnt. Just there. You see, in medieval cuisine, presentation often beat practicality. This goose pie had been made whole, the bird stuffed, spiced and wrapped in dough without completely plucking it. Why? Because a full goose, feathers, beak and all, looked grand, looked rich. The feathers were supposed to burn off in the oven. They didn't, but no one at the table dared speak first, so the lord who made the first slice smiled. Delicate, he said, pulling a tuft from his teeth. Unusual, another replied, quietly spitting into his napkin. The pie was passed down the table. Each guest took a portion. Each chewed carefully. Each pretended nothing was wrong. Because in court, you praised what was served, or you insulted the host. And in this case, the host was a duke. One brave soul, a young scribe, tried to remove the feathers before eating. He picked at his slice like a crow cleaning roadkill, plucked it, peeled it, eventually found a clean bite. He swallowed, nodded, then excused himself. No one saw him again that evening. Meanwhile, the kitchen buzzed in panic. The cook's apprentice whispered, "I told you to pluck it better." The cook hissed, "And I told you we were out of time." In truth, the bird had arrived late, already half spoiled. They cleaned it in vinegar, rubbed it in wine. But plucking takes time, and in royal kitchens, time is always the first thing to be cut. Later that night, servants gathered in the empty hall. They found untouched slices, crumbs, a few bent feathers on the floor. One servant bit into a piece, chewed thoughtfully, then laughed. "Still better than the fish stew," she said. Everyone agreed, because sometimes, in medieval feasts, the food wasn't for eating. It was for showing off, and if you had to chew a few feathers to prove you belonged at the table, well, so be it. The banquet was nearing its end. The fire in the hall burned low. Plates had been cleared, goblets refilled. Laughter softened into slow murmurs, the kind only wine could coax out of nobility. And then came dessert, but not the kind you might expect. No fruits soaked in syrup, no cream-filled pastries. Instead, a long black tube, twisted at both ends, was carried out on a tray lined with herbs. The server announced it with pride. "Pig's blood pudding, with oats and spices." A few guests clapped. Others raised eyebrows, but no one refused, because blood pudding, as strange as it sounds now, was once considered a delicacy. It was made fresh that morning. The pig had been bled at dawn. The blood caught in a wooden bowl, stirred constantly to keep it from clotting, then mixed with barley, fat, chopped onions, and a generous pinch of pepper. Stuffed into intestines, boiled, left to cool, harden, darken. The result, a black sausage, with the texture of wet bread and the taste of iron and onions. It was served warm or cold, fried or sliced thin. And at noble tables, it was often the final course, a rich, heavy pudding that was said to ground the body after too much meat and wine. Ground it, yes, maybe even shocked it. One guest lifted a slice with a gold fork. It wobbled slightly. He sniffed it, earthy, meaty, sharp. He bit in, carefully. The outer skin resisted. The inside crumbled like wet clay. He chewed, then nodded politely. Across the table, someone whispered, "I can still taste the barn." And yet, no one complained because blood was valuable. It meant nothing went to waste. It meant you were practical, resourceful, even refined. Peasants made it for survival, but nobles ate it for show. In the countryside, families gathered around pots of bubbling blood, stirring with wooden spoons. Children held their noses. Mothers salted heavily. Fathers told stories to distract from the smell. They didn't call it pudding, they just called it food. But at the banquet it was wrapped in rosemary, sprinkled with dried fruit, served with slices of pickled apple on the side, to soften the taste, or maybe to confuse it. One lady dabbed her lips after each bite, as if sipping something delicate. Another whispered that she preferred it cold, like a meat jelly. One lord claimed his cook back home added mint. He was lying. Later that night, when the candles burned out and the pudding tray sat mostly full, a kitchen boy crept into the hall. He tasted the leftovers, chewed slowly, swallowed hard, then wiped. His mouth, and said aloud to no one in particular, "Tastes better with salt." And maybe it did, or maybe it didn't matter. Because in the strange shifting world of medieval cuisine, even blood could be made noble. As long as you called it pudding, they said it made you stronger, that eating the heart, warm, bloody, still pulsing, gave a man the courage of the beast it came from, that its power would pass into your blood, into your bones. And so, in some corners of medieval nobility, they did just that. They ate hearts, raw, warm, sometimes still twitching. It wasn't every day. It wasn't for the faint of stomach or faint of rank, but in moments of war, of illness, or even superstition. Some lords believed a freshly removed animal heart held something more than flesh. It held life. The scene was quiet, intimate. A deer had been hunted that morning, a clean shot with a longbow, taken by the lord himself. His men dragged it back through frost and leaves, and when it was laid on the stone table in the castle yard, he did not wait. He ordered the chest slit open. Steam rose from the wound. The butcher stepped back. The lord reached in and pulled out the heart, still warm, still slick. He held it high, not with pride, but with something more primal, then brought it to his lips and bit. The blood ran down his chin. The flesh resisted. His teeth tore it free, and the men watching, the squires, the knights, they cheered, or at least pretended to, because to refuse would be to question his strength, and questioning strength in a medieval court was dangerous. This wasn't just about hunger. It was ritual. Part medicine, part magic, part madness. In some traditions, eating the heart of a wild boar was believed to give bravery, of a stag, endurance, of a wolf, cunning. No one knew if it worked, but that never stopped belief. Some cooks in noble households were asked to prepare hearts just barely cooked, seared quickly over flame, served with only salt and wine. The texture was rubbery, the taste metallic, the symbolism undeniable. But there were quieter stories too. A young prince, too pale and too sickly, was fed small slivers of lamb heart each morning by a worried nursemaid. She told him it would make his breath come back. He died before winter, but she kept feeding the rest of the children, because hope, no matter how messy, dies last. Back in the castle yard, the lord finishes the last bite. He wipes his mouth with his sleeve, says nothing, walks back toward the hall. The butcher stares at the blood on the table, then quietly begins cutting the rest of the meat. Later, that heartless deer would become stew. The men would eat it. They wouldn't talk about what came before, because the heart was already spoken for. In a world where strength was survival, and belief shaped the blade as much as metal did, eating a heart wasn't madness. It was insurance, even if it tasted like death. The kitchen smelled like wet stone and garlic. Not the sharp garlic of roasted meat, but something older, softer, like cloves left too long in oil. In a pot, blackened with use. Something thick and pale simmered over a low fire. Bubbles broke the surface. A green leaf floated lazily near the edge. And beneath that surface, dozens of snails. Some whole, some already dissolved into the cloudy broth. The cook stirred slowly, one direction only. Clockwise, always clockwise. This wasn't food. Not exactly, it was medicine, or so the court physician claimed. He was the one who'd ordered it prepared. Snail soup with 7 sacred herbs. A dish prescribed to ease stomach, pain, drive away melancholy, and, in the words of his journal, encourage a clean and dreaming sleep. It was served to nobles who couldn't eat, who wouldn't eat, or who imagined illness in every breath, which, in medieval times, was often snails were thought to cool the blood, to settle heat in the liver, to soften inner storms, and when boiled with herbs like horehound, rue, sage, and wild violet, The mixture took on a strange, slippery calmness. One lady of the court, pale and thin as parchment, sipped it every night before bed. She said it tasted like river fog. She also said it made her dreams glow with color. Another noble claimed he felt his bones stop creaking after 3 days of sipping the broth. One squire swore it gave him visions. The cook said nothing. You see, snails were easy to find. After rain, they'd collect in gardens, crawl along walls, clump beneath barrels. They were poor man's food, rich in texture but not in taste. But once a physician called them holy, they became noble. The herbs, too, were gathered in silence. At dawn, women walked to the edge of the woods, picked in sets of 7, always odd numbers, always before the sun touched them, not for flavor, but for power. The soup was strained 3 times, served in a small cup, no spoon, just sipped. If you swallowed slowly, the slime passed unnoticed. If you thought about it, it clung to your throat, but it worked, or at least, it seemed to, and that was enough. Of course, not everyone believed. One visiting knight sneered at the bowl handed to him. He sniffed, frowned, tipped the whole thing into a plant pot. The next morning, the plant was dead. He told the story for years. Still, the kitchen kept boiling, the snails kept crawling, and the nobles kept sipping. Because healing in those days was rarely about fact. It was about ritual and repetition, and the comforting weight of warm broth in a shaking hand. Maybe it was magic, maybe just mucus. Either way, they slept. The hall was glowing, torchlight shimmered on stone walls. Golden banners hung heavy in the warmth of the fire. Plates clinked. Dogs circled the edges of the table waiting for scraps. At the long center table sat nobles, draped in velvet, furs, and pride. And before them, food, not plated, not served in neat portions, just piled. Roasted, birds stacked on silver platters, baskets of bread, torn and tossed, puddings wobbling in copper bowls, stews overflowing from trenchers made of stale bread, and not a fork in sight, because in this time, in this place, you ate with your hands, even if you were royal, even if your sleeves cost more than a servant's yearly wage, even if the food was sticky, greasy, or still bleeding. The feast was lively. One noblewoman ripped into a roasted partridge with both hands, juice running down her wrists. A duke tore bread in half and dipped it into a bowl of wine-soaked meat. A knight, already tipsy, reached across the table and grabbed a whole peach, only to squish it accidentally in his palm. The juice shot sideways, landing on a bishop's sleeve. They laughed, mostly, but under the laughter, under the loudness, was the mess. Sticky fingers, greasy lips, crumbs caught in beards, puddings that oozed across fingers and dripped to the floor. It wasn't careless, it was normal, because in the Middle Ages, cutlery was rare. Knives were for carving, not eating. Spoons were for soup, if you had one. Hands were the tools of the table. And yet, appearances still mattered. So nobles trained how to eat gracefully, with 3 fingers, not 5. Thumb tucked in, pinky extended. They held napkins, wiped discreetly, and always licked only the side of the thumb, never the whole hand. These were the rules, and everyone followed them. Until the wine flowed, as the night wore on, the feast became heavier. Roasted goose stuffed, with figs, venison glazed in honey, a pie that collapsed when cut, spilling eggs, nuts, and hot broth across the table. No one minded. They just scooped it back in, with fingers, with bread, with laughter. At one point, a noble leaned too far forward, trying to bite a dripping pear. He missed. The pear slid from his hand, bounced off the table, landed on the floor. A hound ate it instantly. No one paused. No, one gasped. Because all of this, was how feasting worked. It wasn't clean. It wasn't polite by today's standards, but it was joyous. It was real. It was human. Afterward, the servants brought basins of rose water. Each guest washed their hands while chatting, the water turning cloudy with grease and crumbs. Some joked that the meal was more on their fingers than in their stomachs. Others didn't even bother washing. They just left, hands sticky, smiles wide. And in the quiet that followed, as the fires dimmed and the scraps were swept away, one thing lingered: the scent of meat and the feel of warm bread still clinging to the fingertips of memory. Because in a world without silver forks or porcelain plates, the meal was in your hands, literally. And somehow, it tasted better that way. The jar looked innocent enough: round, clay, tied at the mouth with string and sealed with wax. It sat on a shelf in the corner of the pantry, half hidden behind bags of barley and bundles of dried herbs. But anyone from the village knew what it held. They knew by the smell: sharp, sour, earthy, with something else beneath, something warm, something animal. These were the healing pickles: cabbage, garlic, and onion, fermented not in vinegar or salt, but in cow urine. Yes, you heard that right, Jai Say. It was a real recipe, mentioned in old folk remedies and passed down quietly among herbalists and midwives. Because back then, people didn't always separate medicine from food. Sometimes, lunch was both. The logic made sense to them. Cow urine was warm. It came from a living body. It was believed to carry strength, purification, and fire. Mix it with cabbage, known to balance the stomach, and garlic, thought to fight evil spirits, and you had a pickled potion. Leave it sealed for 3 days. Bury it under hay. Open only when needed, or brave. It wasn't popular. It wasn't common, but it existed. And for those who believed, it worked. One farmer's wife, known for her stubborn health, ate a spoonful each winter morning. She lived to 90, or so they say. Another man, suffering from black bile, was made to eat a full bowl by moonlight. He fainted, but woke up feeling lighter, probably from vomiting. A priest once declared the practice sinful. He claimed no holy stomach should host what came from the rear of a beast. But then he caught fever, and an old woman brought him a jar. He never spoke of it again. To be fair, not all versions used urine directly. Some recipes diluted it with wine or herb water. Others boiled it first, mixed with honey. There was variation, and plenty of guessing, because medicine in the medieval world was about trial and error, and a little bit of faith. The taste, hard to describe. Sour, obviously. Sharp, slightly sweet from the cabbage. Then something warm and unsettling at the end, like hay left out in summer rain. Those who ate it regularly claimed the taste became familiar. Those who didn't, retched. But still the jars were made, the pickles prepared, and in quiet corners of cottages, people spooned them into bowls. Not every day, but on days when the chest was tight, or the dreams were dark, or the world felt just a little heavier than usual. Because to them, healing wasn't always soft. Sometimes it burned, sometimes it stank. Sometimes it came in the form of something no modern kitchen would allow near a table. But it was the trying that mattered. The belief, the bite, the idea that maybe, just maybe, inside that jar was something ancient and powerful, even if it tasted like cow. The bells rang softly at sunrise. It was a fasting day. Again, no meat, no dairy, no eggs, not even broth made from bones, just bread, maybe some beans, and if the church was feeling generous, salted fish. But not everyone could afford fish, not even bad fish. So people improvised. One man, a stonemason by trade, had a trick. He'd carry a smooth, flat stone in his coat pocket. Not too big, not too small. Just the size of his palm, and every fasting day at mealtime, he'd place it on his wooden plate, sprinkle it with salt, close his eyes, and pretend it was fish. He'd lift it carefully, bite gently, not enough to break teeth, just enough to feel weight. He'd chew air, swallow, and sigh. Around him, the other workers didn't laugh. They did the same, because hunger was harder when memory still remembered flavor. So they played tricks on themselves. Some rubbed herbs on the stone, thyme, garlic, even ash. Some heated it over the fire to release aroma. One man swore that if you licked it slowly, it brought back the taste of trout. No one believed him, but they tried it anyway. These weren't madmen. They were clever, because the line between belief and survival was thin, especially during long church-mandated fasts that could last weeks. And when your stomach growled and your hands were empty, even a warm stone could feel like food. The clergy didn't always approve. Some said it was mocking the rules. Others smiled and said, "If the Lord gave you memory, use it." Besides, no one was eating meat. Not really, just pretending. In one village, a baker made ghost pies, crusts filled with nothing, just air and a pinch of salt. He sold them for half a penny, and people bought them, held them, bit into them, and remembered what pie used to taste like. Children were taught to chew slowly, even when there was nothing in their mouths. It helped somehow. It made the wait easier. Not everyone had the discipline. Some broke the rules. A few snuck a sausage under a cloak. Others whispered apologies between bites, but most just endured and found comfort in ritual. Even if that ritual meant biting a rock. The mason who started the trick? He passed the stone to his son when he grew too old to work. The boy added a line of carved scales on the back, called it his fast fish. He never went a day without it in his pocket. Years later, they buried him with it, tucked under his hand, as if even in death, he might get hungry, and maybe, just maybe, it would still taste like fish. The bell rang 3 times, not fast, not loud, just enough to echo down the stone corridor and into the cold air of the monastery kitchen. It was time to eat. The monks rose from their benches in silence. No one spoke. They walked, hands folded, eyes down, toward the refectory. A long room, plain and narrow. Wooden tables on both sides. A single candle at each end. No decoration, no aroma, just stillness. At each seat, a bowl, a spoon, a crust of bread. On some days, there might be soup. On others, just beans. And on the strictest days, nothing warm at all. There was no meat, never meat. Not because they couldn't afford it. The monastery had its own gardens, its own hens, sometimes even cattle. But because meat was desire. Meat stirred the blood. And in this place, the goal was stillness, of the body, of the mind, of the soul. So they ate, modestly, 1 spoonful at a time. The broth was thin, root vegetables mostly, a bit of barley, a green leaf, if in season. The bread was 2 days old, hard, but dipped in soup, it softened, and silence made the chewing louder, at least in the ears. They did not talk during meals. Instead, one monk stood at a podium and read from a holy book. His voice was soft, steady, unwavering, passages about patience, about hunger, about resisting temptation. The words filled the room more than the food. A new monk once whispered during lunch. He asked if there might be honey. The older brother beside him said nothing. But that night, the novice scrubbed floors until the moon rose. There were no seconds, no refills, no snacks later. And yet, no one complained because meals here weren't about satisfaction. They were about discipline. Sometimes when a monk fell ill, he was given a boiled egg. This was considered generous. Others watched without envy, only with quiet acceptance. On feast days, rare and few, the table changed. Cheese appeared, stewed apples, even herbs fried in oil. But still, no meat, not even for Christmas. In winter, the soup grew darker, richer perhaps, but the silence stayed the same. One monk, old and near blind, said once, "The less you expect from the bowl, the more it gives." And so they expected nothing. And yet somehow they left each meal steady, not full, but not empty, just balanced. Afterward, they rose together, bowed, and walked back into prayer. The bowls were washed, the candle pinched, the room reset for tomorrow, because in the monastery, food was not celebration. It was order. It was quiet strength, and in that, silence, between spoon and scripture, they found something greater than taste. The court was buzzing that morning, not with noise, but with tension. A duke had arrived unannounced. The bishop was late. The cooks were behind schedule. And yet, the king sat calmly at the head of the table, waiting. The kitchen roared with panic. A pie, the centerpiece of the noon meal, had been left too long in the cellar. It was meat, mixed with soft fruit and nuts, sealed in a thick crust, and when they opened it, they found movement, tiny white maggots, wriggling through the filling. The sweet aroma now laced with something ripe, something wrong. The cook paled. The servants panicked, but the steward shook his head. "It's too late. Serve it," because this wasn't just a pie. It was a symbol, a gift from a noble house, a dish made with expensive spices, wrapped in golden pastry and stamped with a crest. To reject it now, in front of guests, would be to insult an entire family. So they plated it, carefully sliced away the worst spots, covered the rest with a thick sauce, and brought it out, steaming, decorated and deceptive. The king saw it. He knew. Immediately, he'd been raised in courts. He'd smelled bad pies before, but he said nothing. He cut a piece, raised it to his lips, chewed, swallowed, then nodded. A bold flavor. The hall relaxed. Others followed suit. Some poked at their plates. Some nibbled. A few pushed pieces aside, with excuses. But none dared speak the truth, because the king had spoken first, and his silence had protected the court. Later, in private, his squire asked him plainly, "Your Majesty, why did you eat it?" The king wiped his mouth and answered without blinking, "Because sometimes a rotting pie is easier to stomach than a political war." This was not rare. Maggots in food were common, especially in summer months. Meat spoiled fast, even pies. Say, sealed and baked, could turn within a day, but throwing food away was wasteful, and refusing food offered in honor? Dangerous. So people learned to chew carefully, to scrape away what wriggled, to cover what smelled, and if they were noble, to smile while doing it. Old soldiers used to say, "A live maggot has less bite than a live insult." Peasants had a different take. They simply said, "Protein is protein," and laughed. In some villages, children were even told maggots meant the meat was rich, that it had matured. Most didn't believe it, but if you were hungry enough, belief was easy. That king, the one who ate the maggot pie, he ruled 15 more years, fought 2 wars, signed 5 treaties, and never once mentioned that lunch. Because in the grand theater of medieval life, a pie was never just a pie. It was status. It was survival. It was strategy, even if it squirmed. The sun had long disappeared behind the hills, but the town was not asleep. Not tonight. Beneath banners and lanterns, along crooked cobbled paths, the night market stretched open. flickering in the dark like a dream. Children ran barefoot past fire jugglers. Old women leaned over tables of silk, and in the smoky air hung 1,000 smells: sweet, sour, burned, and unknown. This was not the market of bread and onions. This was the market of treats. At the edge, a boy sold fried beetles, tossed in ash and honey. He grinned with blackened teeth and said, "Crunchy like walnuts, sweeter than figs." Few believed him, but some dared to try. A little further down, an old man stirred a bubbling pot over coals. Inside, milk, herbs, bits of root, and what looked like feathers. He called it angel's syrup, offered it by the sip, 1 copper at a time, said it made your dreams bright. Some said it gave them nosebleeds. And next to him, a woman selling something wrapped in cloth, warm, soft, smelling faintly of smoke and sugar. You opened it to find a cake made of mashed peas and honey. Green, lumpy, sweet, confusing. You didn't finish it, but you didn't forget it either. These were the snacks of the strange. Festival food, celebration food. Food you tried once and maybe regretted, but always remembered. There was a booth with cinnamon apples burnt black on the outside and still raw inside. Another with candied rose petals dipped in vinegar, sour enough to sting, sweet enough to keep eating. A man in a mask sold sugar rocks. They were just lumps of salt rolled in honey. Children cracked teeth on them every year. But no, one shut the booths down. No one called it cheating, because at the night market the rules were soft. The food was play, and risk was part of the flavor. Some stalls offered tiny bottles of colored syrup that claimed to cure lovesickness. Some gave you strange hiccups. Some made your tongue blue for a week. One girl claimed she could see ghosts after sipping the purple one. She became very popular that year. Back then, sugar was expensive. Real spices were rarer than gold. So people got creative. They boiled tree bark in syrup, fried weeds, made jelly from boiled hooves and pretended it was fruit, and called it all delightful. You didn't go to the night market to eat well. You went to eat curiously, to taste something you'd never dare make at home, to share a bite and a laugh, to chew, wince, giggle, and keep chewing. And when it ended, when the torches dimmed and the vendors packed up, you walked home with a full belly and a confused tongue. You'd wake up the next morning, unsure of what you ate, but certain you wanted to go again next year, because in the strange candlelit corners of the medieval world, junk food meant joy, even if it was just a burnt apple or a beetle dipped in ash. The boy stared at the tray. It glinted in the afternoon sun, piled high with what looked like stones, round, lumpy, translucent. They shimmered faintly, like jewels or ice, but they weren't either. They were candy clumps, or so the merchant said. He leaned forward, smiling with too many teeth. "Boiled sugar," he whispered, "with herbs, for your heart, or your sweetheart." The boy offered a coin, a precious thing, and received a lump the size of his thumb. He bit in. It cracked, then stuck to his teeth like tree sap and tasted like ash and mint. But he didn't complain, because this was candy, and candy was rare. In the Middle Ages, real sugar was precious, imported, expensive, sometimes guarded like gold. So when it did appear, it wasn't for children. It was for nobles, doctors, priests, weddings. For everyone else, there were fakes. Candy clumps were one of the first. Made from dried fruit boiled until it hardened, tree sap mixed with soot. Yes, really. Or barley syrup cooled on stones and scraped off like glass. Some were flavored with herbs, some with flower petals, most with hope. The results? Lumpy, sticky, and often confusing. You might expect honey, but taste sage. You might think it's apple, but it's vinegar with cinnamon. You might chew twice and find something sharp, but children still bought them. Saved coins, shared bites, bragged about who could suck one the longest without spitting. They chipped teeth, got sick, and went back the next week for more. One woman in the village made hers in her fireplace. She poured old syrup onto cold stone, let it harden, then broke it into uneven pieces with the back of a knife. Wrapped them in cabbage leaves, called them winter sweets. People lined up at her door every feast day. In towns, some vendors dyed sugar clumps with crushed beetles, or used powdered chalk to make them look whiter. There were rumors of a merchant who sold lemon drops made of lard and sand. No one could prove it, but no one trusted lemon drops after that. Still, candy meant celebration, even bad candy, even dangerous candy. Weddings had sugar cubes dyed pink. Funerals had black licorice lozenges to calm grief. Children's birthdays sometimes featured sugar rocks so hard they could be used as weapons. But no one minded because it wasn't about taste. It was about having something sweet when life wasn't. One old woman told her granddaughter, "Candy is a promise that something good can come in a small bite, even if the bite chipped your tooth, even if it stuck in your molars for days." Today, we call it cheap. Back then, they called it precious. And in the crooked markets and crowded feasts of medieval life, a single sugar clump could be enough to make a child smile for hours, even if it tasted like dirt. He knelt by the side of the road, not in prayer, not in pain, just digging. With 2 fingers, he scraped a patch of pale earth into his palm. Dry, powdery, almost white. Then, quietly, he brought it to his mouth and ate it. No one stopped him because, in his village, and many others, eating dirt was normal. Not all dirt, of course. It had to be the right kind: clay, soft, chalky. Often found near riverbeds or under old churches. Sometimes baked, sometimes raw, sometimes mixed with herbs, or dried in the sun until it crumbled like bread. They called it clean earth. To them, it wasn't just dirt. It was a remedy, a ritual, a snack. Mothers gave it to children with sour stomachs. Travelers carried small pouches of it to settle the insides. Some said it protected against poison. Others said it calmed sinful thoughts. No one knew exactly how it worked, but they knew it felt grounding. One woman claimed it helped with hunger. Another said it stopped dreams that chased her at night. A priest once chewed a ball of dried clay before every sermon. When asked why, he simply said, "It keeps the world still." In certain towns, vendors sold clay in bundles, tied with twine, wrapped in cloth. Some carved them into little shapes: fish, coins, tiny loaves. They were dipped in vinegar, sprinkled with salt, even sweetened with syrup, if one could afford it. Children would trade them like candies. Of course, not everyone approved. Doctors called it dangerous, said it clogged the stomach, that it was earth pretending to be bread. But their voices were few, because for many, dirt wasn't just food. It was familiar. During famine years, people dug clay when fields were bare. During illness, they ate it to pull sickness from the blood. Some monks believed certain soils held divine properties, especially if taken from near relics or tombs. There are records of markets in France and parts of Eastern Europe selling edible earth alongside apples and eggs. One merchant advertised his as blessed by wind and worm alike. Sales were good, but it wasn't without risk. Bad clay made people sick. Too much caused pain. Some pits were tainted, mixed with dung or ash, and led to fever. But still, they ate. Not because it tasted good. Not because they misunderstood, but because it was part of the rhythm. Bite, swallow, feel full, just enough. And when people asked why, the answer was often simple: because it helps. No need for more. Today we might call it strange, or unsafe, or unthinkable. But back then, when food was fleeting and medicine a mystery, a mouthful of dirt felt like control, like a choice, like a quiet way to say, "I can handle this." It began, like most things in the village, with hunger. The fields had been dry. The bread was gone. Even the soup had turned thin. So when the boy found the mushrooms under the oak tree, round, red, speckled with white, he didn't ask questions. He picked them. He brought them home, and his mother cooked them in a pan with old butter and salt. That night, they dreamed of colors they couldn't name. In medieval times, the line between food and poison was thin. Thinner still when you were starving. Mushrooms were mysterious. They sprang up from nowhere. They grew fast. They disappeared even faster. Some were delicious. Some were deadly. Some were something else entirely. People called them names like witch's bread, goblin hats, saint's ears, or simply the red ones. And the red ones, they made you dream. Not always good dreams, not always gentle ones, but dreams so vivid, so loud, they felt more real than waking. Some said they saw angels, others demons. Some saw people they missed. Some saw people they hadn't met yet. There were stories of entire villages sharing a pot of stew made from the spotted caps and spending the night howling at stars, then waking the next morning with smiles or nosebleeds. Sometimes both. A monk once recorded, "I saw a lion made of light, and he called me brother. I have not eaten meat since." But not all experiences were holy. One farmer claimed the mushrooms made his goats speak Latin. His neighbors disagreed. The goats too. Still, people ate them because hunger is powerful, and mystery is tempting. To be clear, they didn't always eat the mushrooms to dream. Sometimes they just wanted to feel full. Sometimes they didn't know, and sometimes they hoped the dream would be better than the day. A widow in one village boiled mushrooms into a thin tea. She drank it once a year, on the night her husband died. She said he visited her in the steam. Her daughter never drank it, but she kept the recipe just in case. Church leaders warned against eating of false nature, but quietly, some priests confessed to tasting them. And quietly, some described visions of fire, rain, and birds with human eyes. Mushrooms were unpredictable, but predictable things were rare. They were free. They were strange. And in the dark, they whispered, "Eat me. See something new." So people did. They fried them, stewed them, crushed them into powder and stirred them into wine. They told themselves it was for healing, or clarity, or curiosity. But mostly it was this: a need to escape the weight of the world, even for a few trembling hours. And when the dreams faded and the sky turned pale, they returned to their fields, barely remembering. What they saw, just knowing, they saw something. It happened once a year, when the wind turned sharp, and the nights arrived too soon. When the leaves curled dry at the edges, and the fires in cottages burned longer than usual. It was the feast of the dead, and in villages, across the land, people baked soul cakes, small, round, scored with a cross on top, made of flour, fat, nutmeg, and dried fruit. If they had any, they weren't grand. They weren't meant to be. They were made for the dead. The idea was simple: one cake, while one soul. Give it away, and a spirit might be freed. Eat it, and remember, someone lost. Place it on the windowsill, and perhaps no one would visit you in the dark. Children walked door to door with cloth sacks, chanting, "A soul cake! A soul cake! Please, good missus, a soul cake!" They weren't begging. They were collecting, for the dead and for themselves. Because while the cakes were meant as offerings, they were also treats. A sweet bite in a life that was mostly bitter. Some were soft, like buns. Others were flat and dry, closer to biscuits. They tasted of clove, of ash, of old fruit and warm spice. Not always good, but always something. Mothers baked them in silence. Fathers placed them near the fire. Children snuck them before sunrise. One girl claimed she saw her grandfather in the smoke after her first bite. Another said her sister stopped crying after smelling the dough. People didn't argue, because in those nights, when the veil was said to be thin, no one wanted to test it. In some villages, the cakes were burned. In others, buried. Some were tossed into rivers, one for each name whispered. The rituals varied, but the feeling was the same. A kind of soft goodbye wrapped in sugar. Not everyone believed. Some called it superstition. Others, sacred, but few refused. A soul cake when it was offered, because even if you didn't believe in ghosts, you believed in memory. Old widows made them by hand. Old monks stacked them beside candles. One baker even shaped his into tiny faces, round, blank, peaceful. He sold out every year. By morning, the cakes were gone, eaten, given, forgotten, but something always lingered. A smell in the air, a warmth in the stomach, a silence that felt less empty. Centuries later, some say soul cakes inspired trick-or-treating. Others say it was just a way to stretch flour and faith. But whatever it was, it worked. Because in a world of hunger, darkness, and fear, a small sweet for the dead could bring comfort to the living. The bowl sat at the center of the wooden floor. No one touched it. Not yet. It was wide, shallow, carved from dark wood and stained from years of use. Inside, a lump of cooked rice, still warm. And across the top, a swirl of animal blood, deep red, thick, still shining in the firelight. It was not dinner. Not exactly. It was an offering. In parts of medieval Europe and Asia, food was more than food. It was a bridge between the living and the unseen. And one of the most curious dishes to walk that line was blood-mixed rice. Some called it sacred, others shameful. Some said it healed the sick, others said it summoned spirits, but everyone agreed. It was not an ordinary meal. The recipe was simple: a bowl of plain rice, sometimes barley, sometimes oats, steamed until soft. Then a small ladle of fresh blood, from pig, chicken, or goat, poured over the top. No seasoning, no herbs, just grain and life. The dish was usually prepared at the edge of something important: a funeral, a childbirth, a storm, or simply a fear. It was left outside the home, near the door, or beneath a tree, or on the family altar, lit by a single candle. Sometimes no one ate it. Sometimes someone had to. A father might take the first bite to protect his newborn. A daughter might eat it in silence for a mother lost to fever. It was not about taste. It was about intention. Some said the blood carried prayers. Others said it frightened spirits. A few believed it was feeding the dead, so they wouldn't feed on the living. There's a tale of a village boy who swallowed the whole bowl alone after his family fell sick one by one. He believed it would stop the spread. They said it worked, but they also said he never spoke again. In wealthier towns, the dish became decorated. Blood was stirred with wine. Rice was mixed with nuts or dried berries. They shaped it into little pyramids, tied with thread. But the purpose stayed the same: not to delight, not to nourish, but to acknowledge something bigger. The church disapproved. Clergy called it pagan, called it dirty. But many whispered confessions that they'd once tasted it, out of fear or hunger or love. And the Lord, they said, would understand. No one wrote down exact rules. No one passed recipes. Just gestures, memories, a bowl here, a pinch there, and silence. Today, historians argue over whether it was food or ritual, whether it healed or cursed or simply helped people feel less helpless. But perhaps that's the wrong question. Perhaps the answer is, it was both, because in the flicker of firelight, in the hush between heartbeats, one bite of rice and blood could say more than words ever could. They didn't have coins. They didn't have shops. They didn't even know what candy was. But they had taste, and they had imagination. Children in the medieval village didn't wait for holidays. They made their own fun, and their own snacks, from what the earth gave, from what grown-ups threw away, from whatever didn't bite back. In the corner of a garden, one girl peeled bark from a tree root. She chewed it like licorice. It was bitter, but it was chewy, and that was enough. Boys chased chickens through dry fields, pockets full of river pebbles, smooth, cold, and minty if you licked them long enough. Others sat by the fire stealing pinches of ash from burnt wood. They said it cured hiccups, or heartbreak, or just made the tongue feel funny. One popular treat was cooked kai, tree roots, washed, boiled, mashed with a little salt. It tasted like dirt, because it was dirt. But hot dirt with texture? That felt like a feast. Children learned early what could be eaten, and what only seemed edible. Some nibbled on leaves until their lips went numb. Some swallowed handfuls of grain stolen from storage. Hard, uncooked, but crunchy. One boy chewed beeswax for a week, thinking it was candy. He lost a tooth, but he said it was worth it. They called it eating the world, biting clouds of puffball mushrooms, licking moss after the rain, chewing blades of grass like soup noodles. Not because they were starving, but because curiosity is a hunger too. Once a year after the harvest, kids would gather bits of honeycomb discarded by beekeepers, covered in ants, stuck with hay. But still sweet. They didn't clean it. They didn't care. They just sat in a circle and passed it around. There was laughter, coughing, sticky hands, and for a moment, they felt rich. Some parents scolded. Others joined in. One grandmother told her grandson, "If it's not moving and it doesn't smell like death, try a little." Of course, not all snacks were safe. Children got sick, sometimes worse. But lessons came fast, and mouths never stayed empty long. They found joy in tree sap, scraped fresh and still warm. They made fake cakes from mashed berries and crushed grass, drying in the sun like real food. They pretended they were kings, that a muddy root was roast duck, that licking limestone gave visions. And maybe it did, because in a world without sweets, colors, or toys, tasting the earth was its own kind of magic. Ask an old man what childhood tasted like, and he might say sugar. But the ones from villages, barefoot and windburned, they'll say, it tasted like ash, and bark, and cold rocks, and I'd eat it all again. She lived alone, on the edge of the woods, where the trees bent strange and the wind always whispered. No, one called her by name. They just said her. The woman with smoke, the one who cooks at night. But children called her the candy witch, because sometimes, just sometimes, she left sweets on the flat stone near the well. Not wrapped, not fresh, but sweet and strange, tiny black cakes that crumbled like ash. Candied roots twisted into knots, soft lumps that tasted like honey, then dirt, then honey again. No one knew what was in them, but everyone remembered the taste. The adults warned, which food binds you? Take one bite and your dreams are no longer yours. But the children didn't care. They were hungry, curious, brave in the way only the young can be. They'd dare each other. Steal out after dusk, find the offering stone, and there, always warm, never steaming, was something odd. A burnt fig stuffed with seeds, a wafer pressed with symbols, a little cake shaped like a cat's paw. They never spoke while eating. They just chewed, slowly, like it meant something. And maybe it did. In medieval times, witchcraft and cooking danced close. Herbs became spells. Soup became healing. And sweets became suspect. Women who knew plants were feared. Those who made candies without sugar or bread without flour were watched because food, they said, could twist fate, could open the spirit, could change you. 1. Record tells of a woman who baked honey and poppy seed cakes every new moon. The villagers said she was charming bees to speak. Another made sweets from crushed bones and syrup. No one dared ask where the bones came from, but none of them ever harmed a soul. At least not in ways you could see, because the fear wasn't poison. It was power, the kind of power that came from women who lived alone, who didn't answer to husbands, who knew how to boil bark and sweeten thistle. Some said the witches' treats could cure fever. Some said they made you speak truths. Others claimed they brought dreams of the dead, gentle and clear. A few just liked the crunch. One boy swore he saw his grandfather in a puddle after eating the black biscuit. Another said he could hear ants laugh. Both grew up fine. Mostly, and even when the village chased her out, burned her door, stole her pots, the treats kept appearing. As if the forest itself remembered the recipe, so the children still came, still chewed, still wondered. And the adults? They looked the other way, pretended they didn't see the wrappers, pretended they didn't once taste something similar, long ago, because in the end, witch food was just food made with mystery. And sometimes, mystery tastes better than anything you can explain. The room was dark, not from night, but from ration. There was no oil for the lamp, no fire in the hearth, just a single candle, trembling on the table, and 4 pairs of eyes staring at it. Not for light, but for food. It sounds strange now, but in the hardest winters, the poorest corners of medieval life, people ate candles, not all at once, not with joy, but with quiet desperation. Most candles were made from tallow, rendered animal fat, thickened and cooled into a stick. They were soft, they bent, they smelled faintly of smoke and bone, and if you were hungry enough, they were a meal. One man wrote in a village record, "We shared the candle, 1 inch each. I chewed mine slowly and prayed it would be spring." It wasn't just hunger, it was symbolic. To eat a candle meant you'd run out of everything else, out of options, out of shame. You tore the wax with your teeth, swallowed slow, felt it sit heavy in your gut, and you waited. Some people melted them first, poured the tallow over stale bread, called it meat drip. Others grated it into hot water, made a poor soup, greasy, bland, but warm. There were dangers. Some candles were mixed with resin, or lead-based dye, or wax from spoiled fat. They caused illness, or worse, but still, they were eaten. Because a full stomach, even briefly, felt safer than an empty one. In some monasteries, novices caught sneaking candle wax were punished, but older monks turned away. They understood. One family cut their last candle in 2, thin slices, dipped them in honey saved from the fall, fed them to the children as feast night sweets. The children never knew. They laughed, said it was chewy, asked for more. Candle wax became a secret snack, a quiet shame, a final thread between light and survival. It even found its way into folk tales. The boy who ate the moon's candle and dreamed of summer. The girl who swallowed wax and spoke truths no one wanted. Fairy stories, laced with hunger. And when spring came, if it came, the candles were remade from new fat, fresh herbs, no longer food, just fire. But some couldn't look at them the same way again. Because once you've eaten light, you never forget the taste. The pot boiled slowly. Thick bubbles rose, then popped, then rose again. Inside, water, steam, and a boot. Not a joke, not a story, just hunger. During sieges, when cities were surrounded, food was gone, and silence fell like snow. People turned to whatever didn't kill them quickly. And sometimes that meant boiling leather, old shoes, belts, scabbards, even scraps of saddle, soaked overnight, scraped clean of dirt, then dropped into boiling water for hours, sometimes days, until they softened into something you could chew, something you could pretend was food. They called it boot soup, or just broth. It had no flavor, no warmth, but it had weight, and in a starving belly, that was enough. One soldier wrote in a journal, "I thanked the Lord when the soul came loose. I chewed it like bark and slept without shaking." But it wasn't just boots. In some places they made cloth porridge, old linen soaked in water, stirred with flour, dust and sweetened with onion skin. If you were lucky, if not, it was just water and thread. You tore the rags, boiled them until the fabric fell apart, sipped the starch, swallowed the silence. There are stories, real ones, of entire families surviving a week on nothing but paper boiled into paste. Pages of books, old letters, birth records. They said the ink made it taste wise. In castles, when siege dragged too long, they boiled tapestries, curtains, rope. Whatever hung, tied, or draped. Whatever hadn't rotted yet. It wasn't madness. It was method. Boiling broke down the fibers, released trace fats, gave the mouth something to do. In one monastery, a monk survived winter by boiling parchment scrolls. He cried when he ate the Book of Psalms. Not because of the words, because the glue on the spine made his teeth ache. Children were taught to chew buttons, to quiet their hunger pangs. Some made games of it. Who could chew the longest? Who could swallow without choking? Winners got to suck on coal for dessert. It sounds awful now, but back then, there was no pride left to lose. You ate what softened, what bent, what didn't bite back. And when spring came, when real food returned, they didn't speak of what had filled their stomachs, only that they had survived. Because in a world that burned, starved, and forgot you, sometimes chewing your own, chew meant you still had teeth, still had fight, still had hope. The road stretched for miles, winding between forests, fields, and villages with no names. The pilgrim walked slowly, one foot, then the next, a staff in hand, a small sack on his back, and tucked inside that sack, wrapped in cloth, heavy, square, was pilgrim's bread. It wasn't soft, it wasn't fresh, it wasn't meant to be. This bread was made to last, to survive the heat, the damp, the days. With no fire, it was hard, dense, like stone. But it was his food, made from rye, oats, sometimes old barley, salt if you were lucky. No yeast, no rise, no luxury, baked flat, left to dry in sun or wind, then stacked like tiles or wrapped in linen. You didn't bite pilgrim's bread. You soaked it in water, in wine if you had it, in tears if you didn't. Monk once joked, "Pilgrim's bread isn't chewed. It surrenders when it's ready." It chipped teeth, split lips, broke silence, but it kept you moving, and that's what mattered. Because a pilgrim's hunger was different. It wasn't just for food. It was for answers, forgiveness, a sign, a path. And in a world full of war, plague, and doubt, the idea of walking somewhere holy felt like a kind of meal. So they packed what they could: a crust, a lump of dried peas, a twist of garlic, a prayer folded into cloth. And they walked. Some sang as they went. Others counted steps like rosary beads. Many whispered to the bread before eating, not because it was blessed, but because it had made it this far, and so had they. At night, they'd build a fire, or huddle near someone else's, soak their bread in broth, or chew it slowly, watching the stars blink open above cold fields. They met others, traded stories, traded bites. Yours is harder. Yours is darker. Mine smells like home. Sometimes they reached the shrine. Sometimes they didn't, but always, they finished the bread. And that somehow felt like finishing the journey. Long after, when they returned, if they returned, they'd keep a crumb of it in a pouch, dry, cracked, sacred, not because it tasted good, but because it reminded them. I kept going, even when it hurt, even when all I had was bread and hope. He hadn't eaten in 2 days. His legs ached, his boots were cracked. The only thing heavier than his bag was the silence inside his stomach. Then he smelled smoke, and onions, and something warm. He followed the scent past the curve in the path, through trees, until he saw a fire, and beside it, an old woman stirring a pot. She didn't speak. She just looked at him, nodded once, and pointed to the bowl. It wasn't much. Just water, roots, a few beans, and steam. But he sat down, took it, and ate like it was a feast. In medieval times, soup from a stranger was a sacred thing. Not because it was fancy, but because it was rare. Most people feared outsiders, bandits, disease, bad luck, but sometimes they fed them. Especially those with walking sticks, patches on their cloaks, and eyes full of miles, pilgrims, wanderers, men with reasons too heavy to carry alone. Soup became the soft language of the road. Not thick stew, not noble broth, but wayfarer's soup. Water, bones, wild herbs, bark, even snail shells. Whatever the cook could spare. You didn't ask what was in it. You didn't ask where it came from. You just blew on the steam and took it slow. Some soups were sweet with boiled apples, some sharp with bitter leaves. Some made you warm. Some made you sweat. Some made you see things. There were whispers of sorcerer's soup given at crossroads, of bowls that healed and bowls that cursed. One tale told of a man who drank soup on a mountain trail. He claimed he tasted every face he'd ever loved. He wept for 2 days, then never spoke again. But most stories were simpler. A man with nothing meets someone with a pot. They share a moment, then walk in opposite directions. Full, but not just from food. There was trust in the steam, silence in the spoon, a kind of prayer with no words. Some travelers left things behind in exchange. A stone, a coin, a song. One gave a carved button, said it had protected him during a storm. He placed it by the fire and walked on. The old woman didn't smile, but she ladled another bowl, and another pilgrim appeared, just as the first vanished into the dusk, because the road never ends. And somewhere, always, someone is stirring soup for someone else. Even now, in quiet corners of the world, there are people who feed strangers, with nothing but smoke and kindness. And if you ever find them, blow on the bowl. Eat slow. Say thank you. Then leave. Quietly. Because that's how the road remembers you. The hive was tucked behind the chapel. No one guarded it. No one had to. Because everyone knew that honey belonged to the monks, and the monks didn't share. But the boy was hungry, not the kind of hunger you forget with sleep, the kind that buzzes behind your eyes, that turns footsteps crooked, that makes quiet things loud. He waited until dusk, crept behind the stone wall, lifted the lid of the old wooden box, and inside, light, golden, sticky, alive with movement. He reached in, fast, not careful. The bees found him, of course, but not fast enough. He ran with honey on his hands. And that night, under a tree, he licked his fingers like they held salvation. In the Middle Ages, honey was a treasure. It was sweetness, yes, but also medicine, preserver, symbol of heaven. A spoonful could cost as much as a dozen eggs. It was kept in jars, locked away, offered to saints. But for wanderers? For those who drifted between towns with mud on their boots and prayers in their teeth? Honey wasn't sacred. It was fuel. And sometimes it had to be stolen. Not in anger, not with malice, but with the quiet shame of survival. There are stories of pilgrims sneaking into gardens, lifting lids from hives, risking stings and curses for just one drop. Some said they smeared it on bread. Some let it melt on their tongue like a blessing. Others just swallowed and ran. In some regions, honey was hidden in hollow logs. The smart ones watched bees, followed them from flower to home. They spoke of bee roads, invisible paths to treasure. 1. Man swore he thanked every hive aloud before stealing, said it made the stings lighter. Another left pebbles as payment, arranged in circles, his version of fairness. Not everyone forgave. If you were caught, you could lose a hand. Or worse, your name, because stealing sweetness was stealing from God. That's what the priest said. But the road was long, and mouths stayed empty for days, and a little stolen sugar could turn silence into singing, could turn a flat day into a golden one. It wasn't just about food. It was about reminding yourself the world still had joy, even if you had to take it without permission. A wandering girl once wrote in charcoal on a monastery wall, "I stole your honey, but I left the flowers." They never erased it, because even those who guard the sweetness know what it feels like to need it more than you should. There was no oven, no kitchen, no pot, no pan, just a patch of dirt, a few dying embers, and a handful of flour in a cloth pouch. That was enough. The man knelt, mixed the flour with a bit of water, just enough to bind it. He didn't measure. He didn't speak. He shaped the lump into a flat disc, patted it smooth, then buried it under the warm ashes of the fire, and waited. This was an ash cake, born of smoke, fed by dust, eaten with quiet. In the Middle Ages, it was known by many names: fire cake traveler's bread dust cake, but the recipe was always the same. No yeast, no oil, just grain and will. The outside would blacken. The inside might stay damp, but it was warm. And it was yours. For wanderers, this was the taste of independence. No permission, no charity, just earth, fire, and effort. Some added herbs. Some pressed bits of onion or wild garlic into the dough. But most didn't, because ash cakes weren't made to taste good. They were made to fill the space between now and tomorrow. You didn't eat them in taverns. You ate them squatting by hedges, on rocks, beside ditches, on hills where no one looked twice. You ate them hot, because cold ash cake was like chewing regret. There was something sacred in the simplicity. A monk once wrote, "I met a man who offered me bread from the ashes. I tasted silence. I tasted road. I tasted grace." Women on pilgrimages made ash cakes near riverbanks. They baked them in pairs, one to eat, one to offer. To whom? They never said. But they left the second cake on stones, near trees, in doorways, just in case someone hungrier came along. Children learned the trick early: how to flip it without burning your fingers, how to scrape off the black without losing the soft. One boy called them moon bread, because of the white puff of steam when you broke them open. The ash sometimes got in your teeth, sometimes in your eyes, but never in your complaints, because ash cakes were honest. They didn't pretend to be a feast. They were survival, plain and round. Even nobles, caught in storms or far from home, made them now and then, and always remembered. They said it made them humbler and hungrier. Some claim ash cakes made you dream stronger, that eating from fire connected you to something older than words. Maybe, or maybe it was just the first warm thing in 3 days, and that's enough magic for anyone. The fire was weak. The wind hissed through the pine. Snow dusted the ground, but the man's hands were steady. He reached into his bag and pulled out 2 things: a lump of lard wrapped in cloth, a handful of stones, smooth and cold, and he began to cook. This was not madness. This was mountain survival. When food was gone, when trails disappeared beneath snow, when all you had was breath and will, you made a meal from what didn't belong in one. Fat and stones. The method was simple, if strange. You built a fire. You placed the stones in the flames, waited until they were almost glowing. Then you dropped the lard into a bowl. Metal, if you had it, bark if you didn't, and added the hot stones. The fat hissed, melted, sizzled into a puddle of warmth. You didn't eat the stones. You sucked the fat off them, one by one, slowly, with reverence. Each stone held heat. Each drop of fat was a promise. You are still here. Some travelers dipped dry bread into the melted grease. Others stirred in pine needles, bark shavings, even dust from crushed roots. But many didn't add anything because fat was gold, warm, heavy, alive with energy. And stones? They gave the illusion of more, of something. They tricked the hand, filled the bowl, and when the fat was gone, the stones cooled, ready to be washed and saved and used again. Mountain folk passed down favorite stones: a smooth black one for luck, a red one for heat, one shaped like a tooth. Keeps wolves away. Superstition? Maybe. But when the sky turns white and the trees stop making noise, even rocks feel like family. One tale tells of a woman who fed her children for 3 days on fat and stones. She sang between bites. They thought it was a feast. They never knew the truth. Another spoke of a lost pilgrim who found warmth under a cliff. He had nothing but lard and stones. He survived. When he returned to his village, he refused to eat stew again, said it tasted like too much. This was not a peasant's dish. This was wilderness cooking, half ritual, half desperation, and entirely human. And still today, in high cold places, some hikers carry a bit of fat. Some keep stones in their pockets, not because they need them, but because someone once did. Because in the biting dark, with no map and no noise, you don't need a banquet. You just need something warm to hold and something hot to believe in, even if it's just fat and stones. He didn't know where the road ended, didn't know where it began. But his hand still reached into the pouch. Inside, dry, stringy, rough to the touch. A bundle of salted roots. He tore off a strip with his teeth. Chewed. Waited. No taste at first. Then sharpness. Then salt. Then something like home. In the corners of the medieval world where food didn't travel and people barely did, salted roots were a meal, a medicine, and a memory. They were simple. Pull them from the ground. Scrub off the dirt. Slice into thin sticks. Then soak in brine. Strong, rough, stinging. Dry them in the sun. Hang from rafters. Or bury them in ash and wait. When ready, they were tough, like old leather. Like stories you've told too many times. But when you chewed long enough, they softened. They gave in, and in that giving, there was something close to comfort. These roots weren't special. Wild turnip, horseradish, wood parsley, even tree bark if shaved thin enough. They weren't meant to impress, they were meant to last. Wanderers kept them tied in bundles, strapped to belts, tucked into sleeves. You didn't eat them like bread. You worked on them, bit by bit, chew by chew. Some said it kept your jaws strong. Others said it kept the silence away, because the road was long, and sometimes all you had was the sound of your own chewing. Salt preserved the root, but it also preserved the moment. People flavored them with ash, with smoke, with regret, and every traveler had a favorite piece, a root that reminded them of something they didn't say goodbye to. One man chewed salted root from a tree that grew beside his childhood home. He said it helped him remember his mother's voice. Another woman carried a piece dipped in wine, then dried again. She called it love bark. These weren't snacks. They were anchors. Little fibrous bits of who you were before the road took the rest. In monasteries, monks chewed salted roots during fasting. They said it helped them pray longer and forget the hunger. In prisons, some were given root bundles instead of food. A kindness, they said, or a test. And in graves, quiet ones, unmarked. Archaeologists have found salted roots tucked into the folds of robes, still twisted, still waiting, because even in death, some souls kept chewing. Today, it might seem sad to eat something so dry, so plain. But for those who walked alone without map or name, it was not about flavor. It was about holding on. It swung gently in the wind, tied to a tree branch, wrapped in cloth, greasy at the edges, buzzing faintly with flies. A strip of meat. No sign, no message, no warning, just there, in the middle of nowhere. To a passing traveler, it looked like bait. To the hungry, it looked like hope. And in the strange quiet of the medieval road, sometimes it was both. This was hanging meat, a quiet tradition, half blessing, half gamble. Villagers in highland areas, especially along the older trade paths, believed in meat for mercy. You left it hanging, on trees by crossroads, on hooks near shrines over low fences near fields, a gesture for the hungry, for the passing, for God. Sometimes salted pork belly, sometimes dried deer muscle, sometimes scraps too small to serve but too good to waste. You didn't ask whose it was. You didn't knock. You didn't leave thanks. You just untied the string, tore a bite with your teeth, and kept walking. It wasn't charity. It wasn't theft. It was luck. One old tale said, "If you find meat swinging in the breeze, take it. Quick. It might be a gift, or it might be a test." Some believed it was cursed meat, a trick by spirits or witches to mark the greedy. Others swore it was holy, blessed by monks, left for the chosen poor. But most travelers didn't care, because hunger leaves no room for legends. They bit, chewed, swallowed, and whispered a word. Not always a prayer, sometimes just thank you to the air. Some returned the favor. After a good harvest or a lucky trade, they'd leave their own strip of meat behind, tied high, so the dogs couldn't reach, so only those who looked up would find it. One boy, orphaned, fed himself for a week by walking a road he called the meat path. He said, "It's not a meal, but it's a sign someone ate before me, and someone will after." In some places, the meat was smoked so well it lasted a month. In others, it was gone by sundown. But always, always, it meant someone still believed in strangers. In a world full of locked doors and tight hands, a piece of hanging meat was a reminder that someone had just enough to give. And maybe, someday, so would you. Even now, in lonely parts of the world, you might find a ribbon, a hook, a scrap of cloth tied to a branch. No meat, but the memory remains because the road is long, and a little luck, especially the edible kind, goes a long way. The steam rose from the ground, not from fire, not from pot, but from the earth itself. A shallow pool bubbling gently, smelling faintly of salt and stone, too hot to bathe in, too perfect to ignore. So the traveler took out 2 eggs from his satchel, lowered them in with a thin string, and waited. He didn't smile, didn't speak, but in that moment, he trusted the earth to cook his meal. In certain corners of the medieval world, people believed some lands were generous. They gave fire without flame, water that cooked, and steam that whispered secrets. These were the hot springs. Sacred, feared, respected, and for the lucky few who walked by, they became kitchens. Hot spring eggs weren't common, but they weren't legend either. Travelers who passed volcanic valleys or villages built near geysers learned to boil with no pot, no wood, no smoke. They just needed a spring, a string, and an egg that hadn't cracked on the road, some buried. Eggs in warm soil. Some tied them to sticks and dangled them into pools. Some left them in rock crevices where heat hissed up from deep below. They called them earth eggs, God-boiled, smokeless supper. The results varied. Some eggs were soft, creamy, barely set. Others turned rubbery, gray, strange, but every bite carried a story. Monks on silent pilgrimage called them gifts without asking. They believed if the egg cooked well, your journey was blessed. If it cracked, turn back. One tale tells of a thief who tried to boil 7 stolen eggs in a spring near a shrine. Only 6 cooked. The 7th vanished. He disappeared a week later, too. Another man said, "The egg from the mountain spring tasted like stone and thunder. It filled me for a day and haunted me for a week." Locals sometimes left signs, small painted rocks with egg symbols, or sticks tied in bundles near hot spots. Unspoken instructions for those passing through. And when a traveler boiled his egg and left one behind, tucked gently into a crevice or laid on a stone slab, it was seen as an offering, not to gods, not to men, but to the land itself. Even now, in hidden places, eggs are still lowered into warm pools, wrapped in herbs, salted with river ash, cooked by time and trust, because not all meals are made with hands. Some are made by waiting, by watching, by believing that the ground still feeds the ones who keep walking. No fire left, no road behind, no voice calling your name, just trees, and the steady fall of dusk. He sat alone beneath an old pine, gathered what he had, a handful of grain, a pinch of salt, some wild bark shavings, and a small pouch of ash knot from any old fire, but from a fire made in silence, by monks, by strangers, by those who left no trace. He mixed it with water, stirred it slow, let it sit in the warm belly of coals. And what came out? Something gray, something thick, something not quite sweet, but not bitter either. They called it forest ash pudding, not because it pleased the tongue, but because it settled the soul. This was a meal for the ones who didn't know where to go, the ones who didn't hurry, didn't beg, didn't knock, just walked, and stopped, and sat. In the deep woods of medieval Europe, some hermits, exiles, and tired pilgrims lived on ash-based gruel. Why? Because ash was clean. It came from fire. It came from endings, and it held nothing left to lose. Mixed with crushed roots, it thickened. Boiled long enough, it bound like porridge. Some added forest honey, some dried berries. But most just ate it plain, warm, dark, quiet. A monk wrote once, "Those who eat the ash do not ask for joy. They ask to be held, even if by emptiness." Forest. Ash pudding was food for those who accepted hunger as a companion. Not an enemy, not a trial. Just part of the path. It didn't travel well. Didn't smell inviting. Didn't fill you fast, but it stayed in the belly longer than expected. Like a soft stone, like memory. People whispered that eating too much ash made you forget your name. That it blurred the past, made you gentle, made you still. Maybe that was the point. One traveler said he made ash pudding every full moon, a way of remembering someone who never returned. He didn't say who. He just stirred the pot, ate with his hands, and left no trace. Another made a bowl for a wolf once, left it at the edge of his camp. In the morning, the bowl was licked clean. He took that as a blessing, or a warning. He never said which. No one craved ash pudding, but no one who made it ever threw it away, because when you've walked long enough, even the taste of endings feels like company. He had nothing left, no bread, no roots, no fat, no salt, no scraps, not even hunger anymore. Just emptiness, clean, wide, and still. So he bent down, picked up a small stone, smooth, round, cold, washed it in a stream, held it in his palm, and placed it in his mouth. He didn't eat it. He just let it rest on his tongue, let it sit heavy against his teeth, let the cold speak. This was not a trick, not madness. This was the last ritual of those who walked too long without a reason to stop. Cold stones in the mouth. In the deeper corners of medieval folklore, this was called the farewell chew. Not food, not flavor, just a way to tell your body, I remember what it was like to be full. Some said it kept the throat from closing. Some said it helped them sleep. Others said it made them feel like they still had a choice. Do I turn back? Do I go forward? Or do I stay here with the stone? Children in poor villages were sometimes given stones during fasting days, to calm the belly, to keep them quiet, to teach them what silence tastes like. Pilgrims kept one stone in a side pouch, not for throwing, not for weight, just for the final mile, when nothing made sense anymore except holding on. A wandering woman once wrote in charcoal on the wall of a barn, I walked 4 days on one stone. It told me nothing, but it stayed. Another carved into bark, when I was ready to die, I tasted the earth. It tasted like staying alive. Cold stones were not a joke. They were not a substitute. They were a companion. In old monastic records, there's mention of stone fasting, a vow of silence, and a rock held behind the teeth to keep the mouth from speaking, to keep the soul from asking. Some say the stones chose you, that if you reached into a stream and pulled out the right one, it would be the exact weight your heart needed. Too light, you wept. Too heavy, you left it behind, just right. You carried it and said nothing. Even now, hikers in old parts of Europe sometimes pick up a stone before a long climb. Not for superstition, just for company. Because in the end, you don't always need a feast, or a fire, or even words. Sometimes, you just need something cool and honest to rest against. Your teeth until the next step comes.